first of all, I'm wondering if there's any questions or thoughts or kind of unfinished business from yesterday that anyone wanted to raise. There were, really interesting questions at the end of the day, and the stuff you guys were all talking about. Your work certainly raised a lot of questions. Is there anyone who wanted to bring any questions or business up before we leap into the next part of the program? Okay, good. Couple of housekeeping things. A reminder that there is I don't know how much tweeting will go on, but there is a hashtag for this, hashtag DARTECD for early childhood development. But I would also ask you to respect some ground rules. The briefings that we are getting are on the record, but bearing in mind the safety and security concerns that some of our colleagues in this room have, all of you have really, we'd like you to abide by a non-attribution of questions rule. If you are either tweeting or end up writing this, don't directly quote and attribute stuff to your colleagues without checking with them first. Is that okay? Okay, good. Also, to both our speakers and to all of you, I would remind you to respect the hard work of the translators who are here, so try not to talk too fast. That's a reminder to me more than anybody else. And also, though, a reminder that we do have simultaneous translation all day, and you're free, both speakers and participants, to speak or ask questions either in English or Arabic. That's fine. As I said yesterday, there's a kind of structure, a trajectory to this workshop. We started out yesterday with all of you folks introducing yourselves and talking a bit about our reasons for being here, and we had that interesting overview of humanitarian reporting from Princess Sarim. And now we're going to start by looking at some foundational information and science about children in the refugee crisis. We're going to begin this morning with Katie Murphy and Ghalia Ghawi talking about the state of young children in the refugee crisis. We'll move on through the day to neuroscience and the impact of childhood adversity over an entire lifetime, and the impact of both the impact of trauma and the role of resilience. But then we're going to end the day by talking about what that might mean for us as reporters. There will be a certain amount of data and a certain amount of science thrown at you today. Ask questions. Ride with it. Trust me, we'll get back to journalism, but do ask questions if you find stuff doesn't work for you. Okay? And then as we go through tomorrow and into Wednesday, we will gradually return to the practical journalism questions in a more comprehensive way. We'll introduce the speakers as the day goes on, but I do want to introduce one other faculty member here. That's my colleague Sarah Stillman, who is the director of the Global Refugee and Refugee. Now it's the Global Migration Project at Columbia Journalism School, who is both fully immersed in these issues in her own reporting for the New Yorker magazine, and as a mentor to now several years worth of postgraduate fellows at Columbia Journalism School. She will be leading the first panel.
So thank you, Bruce, for the wonderful introduction. As he mentioned, my name is Sarah Stillman, and I run the Global Migration Project at Columbia at the Journalism School, and I'm also a staff writer at the New Yorker. So I look forward to introducing these wonderful panelists and to diving in, most of all, to the conversation directly with all of you. So I want to save us plenty of time for that. But I wanted to just quickly say a huge thank you, since this is the first panel of the morning, to all of you for coming from such long distances and diverse backgrounds to have this conversation. And to Bruce, especially for convening us, and Ariel and all the Dart Center folks and funders who made this possible. I think we all recognize what a rare privilege and opportunity it is to be in such a diverse room, to tackle such an urgent problem. And no one knows how to throw an intellectual party quite like Bruce with trauma journalists. And I was thinking, as he invited me to this particular gathering, about how rare it is, to be totally honest, that many of us as journalists covering refugee issues really think about the topic that our panelists are expert on today, these early childhood development issues. Honestly, I think a big part of that is journalism has a bias towards people who can talk. Our job is to talk and to converse and to get people on the record. And when so much of your mind is oriented around trying to win the right to have those conversations, I think it's very easy to not think about the people who cannot always speak in this equation, either literally or figuratively. So I think it's really meaningful that we have two people who've invested so much time in understanding early childhood development here to help us frame how we can do this work responsibly. And in particular, I'm also really glad that Faranisa Campana is here today. She was a former fellow at Columbia, but she's the first person who got me thinking about this issue because when she was working as a fellow at Columbia, she embarked on a really powerful photo series about pregnant and parenting young mothers in refugee camps in Greece. And when I looked at the photos and really heard through her about what the reporting process was like, thinking about all of the maternal health issues and then subsequently all of the many challenges that these Syrian refugees and other refugees were facing in the camps, it made me think this has been a huge journalistic blind spot for me. So I'll dive into the bios and then we'll have a brief back and forth amongst us, and then we'd love to do questions. First of all, the translation is coming from where? Oh, okay. I just want to make sure our pace is going okay. Yeah. It's hidden translation. Impressive. Fantastic. So Katie Murphy, we have here today, is a senior technical advisor for early childhood development at the International Rescue Committee, with more than 15 years of experience working in the field of early childhood development, education, and sustainable development. And she began her career at the Peace Corps, which I'm eager to hear about, in El Salvador, where she lived in a rural community for 2 years, teaching in a rural school and doing development, health education, and income generation projects. Katie first began working at the IRC in 2005 as an education manager in Chad, supporting Darfurian refugees. And then after returning to the US, began working at the Earth Institute at Columbia. And you've had a long list of educational experiences and worked in quite a few places in the world. So I think one thing that will really contribute to our conversation is hearing how your work on the Syrian issue compares to your work on early childhood development in Central America, Colombia, India, Kenya, Mexico, and beyond. You've got degrees from University of Pennsylvania, Harvard, and we really look forward to hearing from you. And Ghalia Ghawi, we're pleased to have you as well. You work as a researcher and program development officer at the Queen Rania Foundation for Education and Development, with a focus on research conducted to inform policy in Jordan. She's the lead author of the Queen Rania Foundation's National Early Childhood Development Nurseries Survey and supports other ECD, early childhood development, related efforts at the foundation. And Ghalia has a master's degree from Oxford in childhood development and education. Hope I've got all of that right. You can fill us in on both of your very robust backgrounds in this issue. So I'd love to transition over to you, and I will have, as I mentioned, 20 minutes for your comments, and then we'll transition to Q&A.
Okay, good morning everyone. Sabah al-khair jami'an, and welcome to Jordan. I hope your trips here have all been safe and sound. You're lucky we were snowed in on Thursday, so the weather has brightened up since. So before we actually head into I'm broadly going to cover what is early childhood development, why do we want to learn about this stage, and specifically in the refugee context. But before we dive into that, let's start with a little activity, which is why I asked you all to connect your phones. It's 9 a.m. on a Monday, so let's start it off with a bit of exercise. I'm sure some of you are jet lagged as well, so if you can follow the instructions and go to www.slido.com. So, first question, how energized are you all feeling this morning? We have a bit of mixed responses, so hopefully that changes towards later in the day or a few cups of coffee. And the second question, at what age is your first memory from? So just a small fun fact about early childhood development. So the majority of you responded 3 to 4, 4 to 5. So one thing about early childhood development is there's a phenomenon called infantile amnesia, and that's that children can't form any memories related to events or things that happen to them before the age of 3 to 4. And you'll only form memories if something like really important happens to you, like your mom giving birth to a younger sibling. So this is like one small fun thing about early childhood development to get the juices flowing this morning. But in general, we'll be talking about what is ECD and why is it important, the impact of ECD, why is it such a hot topic right now, and the case of Jordan. So we'll be starting off with what is ECD and why is it important. To start off, many people care about early childhood development. So the book From Neurons to Neighborhoods, which is a great read, starts by saying that children grow under the watchful eyes of many. They grow under the watchful eyes of their parents, who are astounded by their rapid development and growth. They grow under the watchful eye of scientists, who are trying to understand human behavior and development. They grow under the watchful eyes of their schools, who want to try and find the best methods to help children's development and education. Policymakers on how to best inform policies for children's development and their families. Okay, and it's important to note that under scientists, we mean neurobiologists, we mean social scientists, we mean developmental psychologists, and this is important to note because previously there's been an ongoing debate of nature versus nurture, which is a debate that it's your genes that they kind of put you on the outset of life. They dictate your behaviors, your personality, your attitude. Whereas the nurture debate says, no, it's your environment, it's how you're brought up that actually dictates all those aspects. However, with advances in research and science, we can say that it's not nature versus nurture, it's actually nature with nurture. So the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard University says that your genes provide the basic blueprint, and it's your environment and the experiences early on in life that kind of shape the brain architecture. And they keep using an analogy like it's building a house. So you lay the foundations first, and then the experiences keep making connections stronger. And it's very important to note that the brain develops very rapidly at a young age, with more than millions of neurons being formed per second. And that experiences early on help to, with significant adults in the child's life, help to make these connections between those neurons stronger. So you'll have connections between your motor abilities, your language, your emotions, and it's very important that these areas are connected. And significant adults can, with the experiences with their children, can either make these connections stronger or these connections can fade. And so we can see that the role of significant adults in the child's life is very important. So Bronfenbrenner's ecological model shows who are the people who are within the child's ecology, and it's divided into several different levels. So you have the child's microsystem, where you have the child's family, their peers, their classroom, and these are in direct contact with the child. And then the outer layer is how these people interact with each other and how they then influence the child. You have the exosystem and the macro system that have things like your culture, the history, the laws, the media. And so this significant adults can make an influence on 4 main areas of development with adults. So the first one is cognitive development, and this includes things like memory, language, self-regulation, and these can be scaffolded or nurtured in children by reading to the child, by playing small games with them, such as Simon Says, like telling them to sit down, but they actually have to stand up. This can develop their cognitive abilities. You have emotional development, so that's the child being able to recognize their own emotions and the emotions of others. And this can also be developed by talking to the child about their feelings, the feelings of others. There's physical development, which encompasses two broad areas. That's gross motor development, so the movement of your large muscles that you need in walking or running, dancing. So you can put some music to the child, they can dance. Some fine motor skill development is the other broad area, and that's the skills needed in writing and drawing. These can be nurtured by small activities like giving them coloring books, even like asking them to zip up their own jacket. So day-to-day activities that can really influence the child's development. And then you have the social development, and this is the child's relationships with other people and their peers and siblings. And for these all four areas to develop, you need secure relationships, you need a healthy environment, you need nutrition. So see, these are the four main areas of development that significant adults should focus on. And it's very important to note that the brain's plasticity, its ability to change as a result of experience, declines with time, and the amount of effort required to change the brain architecture increases over time. So starting early is very crucial. So we've discussed why ECD is important in terms of brain development and some more biological aspects. But there's also the impact of ECD in terms of individual benefits and social and private returns. So just as we said that starting early is important for the brain, starting early is also a very important investment that can be made. So James Heckman is one of the leading economists in human development, and he said the early investment, the greater the return. So the earlier you start, the higher the return to investments. To quantify that figure, Engel et al. Conducted a study that shows if you increase enrollment in ECD by 25 to 50%, you'll have a return on investment that can be up to $17.6. And in Jordan specifically, QRF conducted a study with Harvard and the University of Jordan about the impact of ECD and the returns it will generate. And so for each dollar invested in Jordan, it is projected to generate $9 in private and social returns and $1.7 in government revenues. And there are definitely robust findings showing the various benefits from investing in early childhood development. So going back to Heckman, he's conducted a lot of studies on many projects that have taken place in early childhood development. Things like, you'll hear the Absidarian project is a very famous project, and the high school preschool project, and the Jamaican study, and they're all studies that have investigated the influence of whether you receive early childhood care interventions or not. And so by studying these projects, they've seen that you can close the achievement gap between disadvantaged children versus their more advantaged peers. Health outcomes can be improved, so children who attend high-quality ECD are less likely to have metabolic diseases. Earnings increase by 25% for disadvantaged children, and then they start to make at level with their more advantaged peers. Additionally, as we just said, there will be return on investment. And again, going back to the study that QRF conducted, in Jordan, 3 years of early childhood development and care was estimated to generate 0.7 of years of additional schooling, and this is so the learning they gain. So not more years of school, but the amount they learn is equivalent to 0.7 of additional years of schooling. They have an increase in lifetime earnings by $23,000 and an increase in life expectancy by 1 year. Okay, so we've talked about the influence of formal ECD and the home learning environment, but also the home learning environment can really influence later achievements. Melhuish et al. Conducted a study that showed home learning environment activities such as talking to the child and activities with the child were a stronger proxy for their later achievement than socioeconomic status, which we know usually is a great contributor to later achievement. Reading with the child or any activities at pre-primary predicted reading at age 15, as shown by the OECD PISA study. Okay, so to wrap up, we can see the many benefits of investing in ECD and paying attention to these crucial years. And I forgot to mention that it's basically from birth or conception up to age 8. So this is what we mean when we say early childhood development. And now to go into the case of Jordan specifically, and what does early childhood education look like in Jordan? So in Jordan, ECD services are fragmented, and as a stage of education, it's not mandated. So we have nurseries, and they cover ages 3 months to 4 years, and they're regulated by the Ministry of Social Development. You have private nurseries, charity-run KG1s, work-based providers. We have the Ministry of Education, who regulate kindergarten 1, KG1, and KG2, private and public, and that's for ages 4 to 6. There's the Ministry of Awqaf, and who provide Quranic learning centers that are like KGs. There are also a scene of unregistered providers. They're home-based nurseries, UNRWA KGs, and these are not regulated with any official bodies. And so following that, we know that ECD is dominated by the non-public sector, and by non-public sector, we mean the private sector and the unregulated providers, the UNRWA providers, home-based providers, CBOs, community-based organization, kindergartens. So of the children who are enrolled in KG2s, 63 are enrolled in non-public offerings. KG2 is the stage that's one level before primary, so they're age 5 to 6 in Jordan. So that's also the case for kindergarten level 1, which is ages 4 to 5. There are no public kindergartens available, so it's all dominated by the private sector, and there are no public nurseries available in Jordan. So if you can see like the black part of the pie chart, it says Ministry of Education based. These nurseries are not open to the general public. They're housed in Ministry of Education public schools. However, the teachers set up these nurseries on their own. They get the caregivers, they pay their salaries, they get the resources, and they enroll their children. So it's not open to the general public. So there are no public nurseries in Jordan. And following that, we can see access is not universal. So QRF conducted a study in 2015 with Jordanian mothers to know how many of their children were enrolled. And only 3% of their children were enrolled in nurseries. Only 20% were enrolled in KG1. And RTI International conducted a study on the KG2, and they found 84% of children were enrolled in KG2s. So access is higher for children who are 5 to 6. However, access for non-Jordanians is much lower than Jordanian student enrollment. Jordanian students, 92% of Jordanian students were enrolled in KG2, whereas only 82% of other nationalities were enrolled, and only 52% of Syrians were enrolled in KG2s. QRF also conducted a study on the nurseries, which Sarah mentioned earlier a little bit, and we found that the quality of so not only is access an issue, but the quality of these programs is an issue. So private nurseries were generally the highest quality, while others lagged behind a bit. Most nurseries had basic equipment such as child-sized chairs and hygiene, but they lacked smoke detectors, they lacked outdoor play areas for things that can develop the physical motor skills that we were talking about. And additionally, some of the basic learning resources were not available, so only 4 in 10 Ministry of Education-based nurseries had books, whereas almost all nurseries had televisions. QRF also, as part of this study, went to Jordanian mothers to understand the home learning environment and whether children are receiving any nurturing environments at their home. And we also found that there are gaps in the home learning environment of the children. 40% never read with their children, 40% never teach letters, 50% never played sports, and 50% never taught arts or crafts. Additionally, a staggeringly low percentage of mothers have ever attended parenting programs. So fewer than 1 in 10 Jordanian mothers reported having ever attended such programs. Although there are a lot of efforts nationwide to increase parental programs, so the UNICEF has worked with several ministries on the Better Parenting Program. QRF is piloting a parenting program as well, the Jordan River Foundation. So efforts are put in place in order to activate the role of parents in the home learning environment. However, to end on a more positive note, reform is definitely underway with several strategies and plans to promote early childhood development. Their Majesties launched the Human Resource Development Strategy in 2016, and there is a whole section on early childhood development within that strategy with several plans on how to promote it. The Ministry of Education has a plan to universalize access to KG2, and they have an education strategic plan that also has a whole sector on early childhood development. The Ministry of Social Development is updating their bylaw and the policies that govern nurseries, and a curriculum reform for KG2 is underway. So a lot of attention is being paid from policymakers and stakeholders for this field. Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Hi everyone, my name is Katie Murphy. I'm really honored to be here today, and thank you Bruce and to all the organizers, Ariel, for all the work that everyone has done in bringing together this amazing group of journalists and participants. I'm so sorry I wasn't here last night to hear more of your stories, but I look forward to learning more throughout the day and spending time together. Ghalia provided an excellent overview of early childhood development, of the science, of why we know it's so important, and she left us on a positive note. I'm going to take us into a little bit of a deeper and darker note to start with, because we're going to focus on why these really critical issues, why what we know all children deserve and must have in order to be healthy, why that is so at risk and in threat in contexts where we work, where children are exposed to violence, where they've been uprooted from their homes, where they've been separated from their caregivers, and what that looks like for the context where we work. And I think hopefully this will provide you with a sense of what your contribution can be to this, because we've seen this has been a neglected field, an area where there has not been enough attention in terms of resources, in terms of understanding the issues deeply, and understanding ways that we can really encourage actors, government actors, humanitarian actors to take this issue seriously and to address it head on with what we know from the best scientific research and from implementation science can have dramatic impacts on the lives of these children. So I'm really excited also to hear your ideas about how we can move this forward together. So in conflict and crisis settings, we know that children are at much higher risk than children in other more stable contexts. So children under the age of 5 are 20 times more likely to die or suffer injuries or disease than children in more stable contexts. In 2016 alone, 16 million children were born in situations of conflict. Oh, sorry, Mike. No swaying. Sorry. So what does that look like in the places where we work? I'm going to show a brief video. Yes. Children were born in situations of conflict. So all that they have known in their first early and most influential years of life has been war, displacement, and chaos. Oops. I'm going to go to this. I'm going to show you this brief video.
العالم كيف بتموت قدامي.
Can you tell me
البلد هلا تدمرت ما ظل منها شيء. نخاف من عتمة الليل. يعني بس أكبر كل اللي بعرف أقرأ وأكتبها هو هذا الشيء اللي بتمنى.
So a generation at risk, but not yet lost. And we see scenes like this wherever we work. Children with their backpacks full, sometimes not filled with books, but with things that they've collected around their house, eager to find a place to learn, eager to find friends to play with. But too often, the environments where they live look just like this scene, very void of any type of positive early learning experiences, caregivers who are busy fending for themselves to find work, to provide for their families, in an environment where their possibility for achieving their full potential, for living up to their dreams, is greatly at risk. And we know from our work around the world, when we talk to caregivers, caregivers like this one, they want nothing more than for their child to be healthy, happy, successful as an adult. Yet they fear, because they know that their child has witnessed unthinkable acts of violence, that they have been uprooted from their lives, that they worry. They're worried that their child will not be okay. Yes? Caregiver is a term we use to say usually mother, but it can be any primary caregiver, is the person who is most responsible for the child's growth and development, the person who is with them on a day-to-day basis. So this could be a biological parent or an adopted parent, and often it can be a grandparent or an aunt or uncle.
Not like an employee or something.
Right, yeah. So I use the term caregiver to mean like a parent, but it could be another family member or, yeah, good question though. But imagine yourself in the shoes of this caregiver. You know, you've heard from the presentation before, the importance of this parent-child connection, that these stable, nurturing, consistent relationships are so critical for children to develop. But what happens when the caregiver themselves are suffering from a tremendous amount of stress, when they themselves don't have the social support system of their family near them, when they themselves are questioning their own ability to provide this stability and care? What does that mean for that relationship between the child and the caregiver? And what does that mean for the child's own future to understand stable and to develop stable relationships and trusting relationships with adults? We won't go into the issue of toxic stress and neuroscience, because I know it's going to be covered in the other sessions that follow. But just to say that we know that this accumulation of adversity, that the various stressors that the child is experiencing during this most vulnerable time of the child's life, when the rapid proliferation of synapses is forming at a rate of, even now they say 1 billion per second, that when the body is flooded with these constantly high levels of toxic hormones that are normal, that we all experience to some level, but when we don't have that love and consistent caregiver to help us deregulate those high levels, that this can have real, clear ramifications within the brain and within the body's entire system. We'll talk more about that in the other sessions that follow, but this is what we call a toxic stress response. And you can see that that the damage to the neurological connections can have long-term impacts on the brain's architecture, on the children's future health, their ability to learn, their ability to form stable relationships. And unfortunately, the situation is dire. As we know, 68.5 million people are displaced currently. These are unprecedented record numbers of people, and that over 50% of them are children. And despite the statistics, despite all we know from science about the importance of early childhood development, about the importance of investing early, very little resources go to education, only 2% of all humanitarian funding. And within that, a very small sliver goes to early childhood development. So it would be a percent of this 2%. Very difficult to sometimes track the funding trends, but we know that it's woefully insufficient given the crisis. Yeah. Yeah.
Just to clarify the 2%, you said that's 2% of humanitarian funding. Is that from states or from the UN and other international organizations?
It's from a mixture. So a lot of it is from bilateral. Some could be from the European Union, for example, from USAID, from the US government, as well as private funders. Yeah. Yeah.
Same question. You mean globally or
globally? Mm-hmm.
Globally,
Mm-hmm.
or in European? Have you got any statistics for Europe?
I don't know the Europe-specific statistics. I can point you to the direction of where there is a pretty good system for tracking global investment in humanitarian funds, and then they do breakdowns by sector, and it's continually updated. So there's a financial tracking system that you can look at, and you may be able to disaggregate by Europe, particularly if you're interested in a specific region. So I can point you to that website. Any other questions? So what's the situation more specifically here within the region? It's difficult to get precise numbers, but the best estimate we have right now from the UNHCR data, from the OSHA data, so this is a combination of refugee children, of internally displaced children, as well as children who've been identified in need of humanitarian assistance in places like Syria and Iraq. And we see 4.4 million children under the age of 5 falling into this category. And you can see the greatest percentage of that is within Syria, followed by Iraq. Actually, I can't see my numbers very well. As well as within Turkey. And I can send you all these slides too. You don't have to memorize. So I'll try to find some silver linings so that we're not depressed. We do have wonderful resources in the global body of evidence about what works for early childhood. And this can provide us with guidance and a basic understanding of what approaches we can take to try to really tackle some of these risks and some of these very difficult problems so that we're not left to think that this is all unsolvable. Of course, there are geopolitical factors that may be beyond the scope of what we're able to achieve, but if we do know that there are effective ways to reach children and to reach them early, we have a responsibility as a society to bring those tools to the places that need them most. One great resource that many of you may be familiar with, but I would encourage you to take a look at, is the Lancet series on early childhood development. And while it does not provide specific details on what the situation is and what the right approaches are for situations of conflict and crisis, what it does do really well is lay out the core of the argument and the core of the basics of the magnitude of the problem, and they really identify the number of children at risk by looking at rates of stunting, so chronic malnutrition, as well as extreme poverty in low and middle income countries. They've identified 250 million children who fall into that category. Then they have a great section that really identifies the effective interventions that can be used for children in these sort of disadvantaged settings. An important note, and one thing that we try to look at when thinking about ECD in the humanitarian sector, is this guidance around the need for multi-sector, so not just a education alone initiative, not just a social work alone initiative, but combining approaches that would provide parenting skills through health systems that reach many, many people, integrating nutrition and responsive caregiving, understanding how we can build early learning into multiple different existing services on the ground can be a way that we can effectively reach many more children in ways that are more scalable and sustainable. You heard in the last presentation also the importance of early childhood development in terms of the return on investment. There's also some great research in this series on the cost of inaction. And I think it would be a wonderful thing to calculate the cost of inaction or a powerful thing, to calculate the cost of inaction in a conflict-affected setting. The 4 or 5 countries that were highlighted in this report were not conflict-affected, but they found that up to 4.1% of the GDP, so if you think of a country like Jordan, I think that equates to 1.6 billion per year. The cost of not investing in early childhood development, in this case it's a high quality preschool, but what would that cost look like in a country where there's absolutely no access to early childhood care, and when we know the stakes are so much higher? And I think those types of arguments are really powerful when we take them to government ministries or to others to state the case for why ECD is so important. And then lastly, the importance of keeping our overarching goal for strengthening government leadership. And this is also a challenge in conflict and crisis settings. Sometimes the government does not want to play an active role in the efforts to provide services for refugee populations when they're hoping that they return. So it can be quite complicated, but it also is something that's so important both for the host community as well as for the children who have a future life somewhere in the world, that they're provided with the tools and skills they'll need to help strengthen communities, help build a prosperous life for themselves. The Nurturing Care Framework is also a wonderful provides great guidance in terms of looking at the intersection of health, nutrition, responsive caregiving, safety and security, and opportunities for early learning. And this has been launched and promoted by the World Health Organization, by UNICEF and the World Bank. And we recently did an analysis of the refugee response plans and the humanitarian response plans and found that in 26 active plans, the incorporation of these elements was quite low. Rightfully so, nutrition is quite prominent, and that's important to keep nutrition front and center in any humanitarian response. But we see lost opportunities where nutrition could be integrating early learning and caregiving initiatives, where we could be actually building upon these existing critical survival-focused initiatives to integrate ECD from the very first days. We talk also about this double marginalization, that the refugees who are fleeing countries are going to countries that themselves cannot provide for their own citizens. So what does this look like? You'll see in yellow, these are all the countries that are hosting large majorities of refugee populations that they themselves may not have functional health systems, functional social services, and so what that means. And you can think of, for young children, the triple marginalization, for them being not only refugees, not only living in a host community that does not have the critical services that are required, but also being young and vulnerable and fragile to disease and to the effects of trauma. And lastly, when we think about what are we aiming for here in our efforts and our work, The global community has come together to strongly put forward an agenda, an ambitious agenda for achieving sustainable peace. We know that early childhood development is a critical foundation and cornerstone for sustainable development and for sustainable, peaceful futures throughout the world. Yet there's a lack of investment not only in young children, but also in these states that are so affected by conflict and crisis. So again, we're putting our global community at risk for these outcomes that collectively we've said are important to us, that we want to achieve. I'll leave it with a happier photo. I think it's important to also remember that wherever we go, it's not always horrible images of desolation, that you find children who are able to play in some of the most difficult locations, and that children are still children. And it's important, I think, in your reporting to try to bring that out while also showing the great risks that these children face in achieving their full potential. But I'm excited to hear your ideas and listen to your questions, and thank you all.
Great, I think that's incredibly helpful background. So I'd like to kick us off by just asking sort of two buckets of questions. The first really about digging into some of the concepts you described, and the second about how all of us in this room might think about kind of applying this methodologically to the journalism and the reporting projects that we're pursuing. So maybe first I can start with the questions specific to the Syrian refugee crisis here in Jordan, because I wonder how you think about the evolving nature of this issue. If we imagine, many people presumed optimistically that, back in 2011, that maybe this conflict would be a short-lived one, and maybe these kids who are going through all the challenges you both so well described might be doing so for a short period of time in refugee camps. And now that we're entering the 8th year, I wonder how that changes the concerns from an early childhood development standpoint, both the kinds of challenges that might exist, but also the opportunities as infrastructure is developed to really tackle this question more intelligently.
Yeah. So, and I think that the Middle East in general has, compared to some of the other regions of the world where we work, they've provided a strong example for how the governments and the host countries are understanding, even though it's been difficult for them and it's not always been an easy process, but understanding how they can better incorporate refugee and displaced populations in their overall national strategies. Of course, this requires resources that many of these countries don't have. If you look at the burden on the educational system in Lebanon or in Jordan, for example, they've had to be creative about opening up second shift programs and understanding ways that they can work around, and this causes additional tensions between the host populations and the refugees themselves, because the refugee children can be seen as taking scarce resources away from a country that needs it. But I do commend these countries for at least trying in ways that you don't always see. I mean, there are other places in the world where the refugees themselves are very isolated and not at all invited to be part of the society.
And you mentioned second shift programs. Could you quickly explain that as well?
Yeah, do you want to?
Yeah, is this on? Okay, so basically second shift programs are when schools operate on a morning versus evening shift. So they'll have a morning start from 7 a.m. till 12 noonish for the host community students, and then the students are all gone, and the second shift comes in from approximately 1 till 4, and these are typically the refugee students. So you can see they have shorter school hours of school. There's not really integration in a second shift system. You have the host community attending one shift and the refugee community attending other. So although they are giving education to students, there's no integration and cohesion between communities. So it's a solution for the short term, but more inclusion and education amongst both would be preferable.
And are there any other aspects of the long-term challenge now that we are entering this stage of the refugee situation here that have ways in which the foundation's work has evolved on early childhood development, or other ways you think the responses have needed to evolve?
So more generally, I think, so considering that we've entered like the 8th year of the conflict, we don't want action to be slow. As we said, every moment counts in early childhood development. You need to start from birth. So starting later on or at age 3 or 4 is too late. We need interventions to start as early as possible. So some of the things the foundation is trying to work on is how to reach disadvantaged communities through e-learning, through mobile apps. We've created a Karim and Jana application that you only need internet to download, but then you can use all the content for free. So you can have some kind of educational experiences without actually needing to go to any facilities, because we know we have problems with access. You know, access is not universal. We don't have enough nurseries at the moment to take in. So while that is happening, we don't want to waste those precious years. So we should be trying more creative and innovative options that until the infrastructure and facilities and resources are enough to take in the amount of refugees that have come in.
I know you both had experiences with these more innovative technologies. I'd love to hear about that and hear you talk a little bit about kind of modes of intervention. Maybe you can tell us more about that app. What is the name of the app?
Karim and Jana. So
yeah, I read a bit about it online. It sounds fascinating. Can you tell us more?
yeah, definitely. So it's a numeracy app. It's targeting 3 to 6-year-old children, and just to teach them some basic numeracy skills like counting, understanding shapes and objects. And we're working on a socio-emotional learning app as well that will be very stories-based and to help students nurture their socio-emotional skills. It will follow the same structure. You don't need any Wi-Fi to download the content. So we're really just trying to have ways to get as much information as possible out there into the hands of young kids and their families. And because we know mobile penetration in Jordan is quite high, smartphone penetration, so it's an easy way to actually get resources into the hands of parents and caregivers.
Katie, can you talk a little bit about the tech side? I know you've done
Sure.
work also with Sesame Street.
Yeah, so tomorrow my colleague Manar will be here also, and we'll give more of the Sesame stuff, but I'm happy to give a preview. So we work, the Sesame Initiative as a whole, I think, addresses some of the issues that we're talking about between the tension of between host community and refugee children. One thing I think mass media does well and has powerful potential to achieve is modeling sort of friendships and unusual friendships, and by putting together characters and children in friendful in playful ways, they're able to sort of show what that looks like, and they've had success doing that in multiple different places. So even in South Africa, some of you are familiar with Sesame's work, but they had an HIV positive Muppet. And it was the first time that they had, really tackled that. She was, I think, a 5-year-old, but looks like a monster. But she had some really cool, important friends like Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and she wasn't sick, and so she was very, very lively and active. But it allowed sort of children who are watching, who might be experiencing that same condition. She also had lost her parents, to really identify with that character and also see how that character can navigate the world and navigate friendships in new ways. And so I think that's a powerful potential for mass media in this context. What we're also doing is a strong emphasis on direct services, because we know that television alone isn't going to really address the more severe needs for a lot of these children and families. So we have programs for caregivers, and this includes, similar to some of the initiatives that QRF is working on, mobile phone-based, very quick ideas for ways to engage with your child wherever you are. And so that really helps for parents that may be on the move or not necessarily in a stable location. But then also connecting them to sort of WhatsApp groups where they can kind of get a little bit of social support and share ideas and talk to each other. We found that that's a really promising way of sharing some cool ideas and trying to promote behavior change around nurturing care. And then we have more traditional sort of parenting group sessions as well as a home visiting model, and we've adapted the Jamaican home visiting model that's been used, and I think it was in your resource pack, so some of you might have read about it, but it has over 20 years of research behind it and showed really strong impacts in terms of increase in adult productivity, income, reductions in violent behavior. And so we've been really excited to use this adapted model here for the Syrian context. And then we have programs for children that span from converting childcare centers into more sort of intentional play-based learning spaces, as well as more formal preschool type programs that we run in places like Lebanon and in Iraq, where we're trying to also adhere to the local ministry standards so that these children are accredited. And it's a basic high-quality early childhood curriculum, but with a strong focus on what we know children who've experienced trauma require. And so ensuring that they have a sense of belonging, ensuring that they have a sense of control, really ensuring that there's a strong relationship between the service provider and the children, and that the incorporation of local culture, of the child's culture, is really done in a more thoughtful and meaningful way. So those are some of the ideas, but more on that tomorrow.
Yeah, no, there's a lot there. I'm curious. I'd love to ask two more kind of intervention-related questions. One is just about, I'm going to keep pivoting this. So I'm curious about this question of play. It's come up in both of your presentations. I'm curious in the room if people have had the experience when you're reporting of seeing children who have just gone through or are in the midst of a lot of trauma playing in ways that can be troubling. Because I think one thing I've certainly encountered as a journalist is seeing incredibly violent play among kids who are mimicking the things that they are seeing or have recently seen. So we read in the literature that was sent around about some of these really positive forms of play, and I'm wondering if you can talk about what you've seen in terms of kids who are affected by war and conflict and how it affects play, and what some of the interventions look like around that, or how we can understand that as journalists when we see that directly in the field. Have people, is this something others have experienced? I don't know, this is particular to me, but it seems like whatever context I'm in. Yeah. Sorry?
It's also not only when they play, but when they paint.
When they paint, right. The drawings and paintings and art or journaling reflected in kids who've gone through conflict can be really intense. Yeah. So this is something that resonates. So I'm curious to hear more about that from you.
You know, it's a really fascinating topic, and one that I would love to understand more, and I think we will be doing a bit more research on this, particularly with the LEGO partnership, because that's something that LEGO is really interested in, this idea. A quick aside, I have a 3-year-old who has troubling play all the time. So I think it's also be careful to notice what's normal, especially if you're not used to working with children. Don't necessarily, immediately jump to the conclusion that rough play or, certain types of, he likes to draw, dinosaurs with really sharp fangs, and it's troubling to me. But no, I mean, in all seriousness, we do know from our work with children that there are clear signs of children who have demonstrated, more severe signs of trauma. And we hear it from our preschool teachers who often, talk about the child that just can't sit still, or the child that just isn't able to engage in play, and or often is retreating from the circle, or just really unable to engage. And those often are the children that we worry the most about. And then I think that we try to work with them to understand ways to address that, but it's a complicated issue. We're actually having a meeting later this week to try to talk about that in more detail and think about how we can improve our own interventions for children and families to really understand the more severe situations of trauma. But yeah.
Did you want to add anything on that, or we can move on? Okay. I'd love to talk a little bit more about parents. And you mentioned in your presentation, Ghalia, the idea that many parents, even not in situations of conflict, may not be doing the proactive work around best practices on early childhood development. You had that slide about a lot of parents, maybe 40% aren't necessarily reading or engaging with their kids in the ways that would be ideal. Can you talk a little more about the ways in which parents going through their own stresses in terms of the realities of being a refugee, perhaps, as I mentioned with Farnisa's beautiful portrait series about women who are trying to mother in the context of a refugee camp or in a very unstable, constantly moving situation. Can you tell us more about this from the perspective of parents who are really dealing with a lot of their own psychological and logistical stresses?
So basically, I think every moment, even a small, some of the research says that you should be very proactive in your child's growing. So even when they're infants and they have the cooing sound, just being responsive to that, and any kind of cries, being very responsive and having a stable relationship. So you might not always have the resources or even the emotional resources to kind of always sit and read to your child or talk to them about their emotions, but every small moment counts. You can't really ignore those outcries from your children, even if they're not very explicit. So when they're dealing with their own troubles, it's very important to not project onto their children, to kind of always make time just to sit and understand their children's emotions, because it's a critical period of development. So any small thing, just sitting and talking with the child about their day, what they've done, all these small things can really count, and they may not be as draining as sitting and reading or taking them to the museum or outside, but just showing some interest, some interaction, these small things, even in times of crisis, will be helpful.
Do you want to add anything more?
Yeah, and I agree with everything that's been said. I think one thing that we found is through programs like the home visiting program, where providing really age-appropriate games and ideas for play and communication have been really helpful for parents for their own stress as well, because I think they feel like they've lost some of their parenting ability in some way, or they feel more self-conscious because they know that they've been so stressed and that they've been feeling almost like a different person, and it helps kind of to remind them of who they are and that they're great parents, to empower them to start to engage in play and reestablish that bond with the child, which is so critical.
Yeah, I think that's something that comes up a lot. I'm curious if others have seen this in your reporting, but I've certainly noticed so many parents expressing just profound guilt and anxiety about the feeling that maybe their children are missing opportunities because of the circumstances in which they've found themselves, and just the pain that so many parents carry. I mean, I feel like this is one of the #1 issues that has come up for me in interviewing people in the refugee context, is that very specific sense of loss about a child's opportunity. So I'm wondering, kind of lastly, on the intervention front, you mentioned this notion of kind of multi-sector interventions, and I'm hoping we can talk a little more about what that looks like on the ground. You mentioned nutrition is a critical factor there. I'm wondering what other kind of pockets might be, whether it's health issues that arise out of direct literal wounds from conflict, or what are the other kind of areas that might fall into the realm of multi-sector interventions?
So, for example, in Jordan, we're working with community health volunteers who, as part of their job, they go to visit homes and check on pregnant women and young women, and they have basic health messages that they're supposed to provide during those visits. And seeing that as an opportunity, because they're already entering these households, we've been working with them to integrate early childhood, really the reach up and learn home visiting model into that system. And so that is one example where, using sort of multi-sectoral approaches, we can integrate ECD content into an existing sort of health service. Additionally, with some of the more stable clinics, we have both kind of static clinics and mobile clinics. Mobile clinics are big trucks that go to some of the remote communities, and static clinics are clinics that are, in a community. But using spaces within those so that when children are coming in, either for their healthy child visits or for other reasons, there's then opportunities to engage both with the caregiver and with the child with some ECD programming. So those are just some examples.
Great. Ghalia, I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about whether there are any gender-specific challenges that you find in the realm of early childhood development. I know in some of the materials that were passed around, we saw information about the many kind of gendered threats that girls face as they get older, kind of in the after 8 category, things like the rise of early child marriages, for instance, among Syrian girls, which I think has gone up. I believe in the literature it said something from 13% to 32% in the last several years. And so it made me wonder whether there might be parallel issues of concern worth thinking about in regard to gender and early childhood development.
So some of the main issues are that parents are afraid to send their children to kindergartens or schools because of any kind of gender-based violence that might occur on their way to school. But additionally, on the other side, there's fear for the males, who are typically also expected to stay at home, help with their parents' work, to kind of have some more income. They need the assistance around the house. So it kind of goes two ways. So we can think about the females who we're afraid for their health and we're afraid for their safety in sending them to schools, but also in terms of the boys, we know that they don't attend as much because they stay and help their fathers with the work. So these are some of the issues around gender-based refugee crisis.
Did you want to add anything on gender?
No, the only other thing I guess is we see the assignment of tasks can often be gendered, like in terms of play and games and activities that that young children are exposed to. And so when we think about wanting to promote gender equality and transformation, it often looks, it takes sort of looking deep into some of those traditional practices and seeing, can we have more of a non-gendered approach to some of those play and communication strategies.
We'll start thinking of your own questions because we have until 10:45, so in a moment I'd like to pivot to hear from all of you about what might be on your minds. Just quickly to shift us towards the concerns that journalists might have directly in writing on these issues, what do you find journalists tend to get wrong? When you're reading media on these issues, what are the areas that are the most common pitfalls for reporting on early childhood development?
I don't think this is something that journalists get wrong. I think that journalists are potentially responding to the appetite of the consumers. But one thing I do find is that there's the emphasis on these highly sensationalized stories, like the Alan Kurdi example, which, for good reason was, headlines and really shocked the world. I think that there was a missed opportunity to talk about what about those who survive, and what about those who, the magnitude of children who have witnessed and experienced similar things, but yet don't have that same fate. I think that there's a little bit of like the story ends once you see, that horrific image or that horrific. So I think digging deeper beyond that is something I think the world would benefit from.
I'd love to hear your thoughts too. And also if you see areas for journalistic opportunity, in the sense that I loved in both of your presentations, you mentioned economics, for instance, which honestly wasn't an angle I thought about as it relates to early childhood development, but you both underscored this notion of kind of the cost of inaction and the opportunity costs of for generations and decades to come. So I'm wondering, you could either think about what are the things that journalists get wrong, and or what are some of the areas of opportunity for stories?
I think some of the areas of opportunities, it's always good to think of what is being done currently, and a lot of things are being done and a lot of attention is being paid. Like Katie mentioned in her presentation, that only 2% of international aid is going to education, so maybe just highlighting the role of education in the early years. We know that a lot of foreign aid is going to health and nutrition, which are also, of course, very important for the developing child. But if we can stress factors such as like parenting programs that are being done that can also influence the child in a very positive aspect. I think when thinking of the refugee crisis, we don't fail to neglect education, but more attention should be paid. Some of the visits we've done in our survey, a separate survey to the Zatari camp, one of the principals told us that a lot of, in the past 6 years, it hasn't been really a school, because so many people were going in and out for nutrition, for health purposes. But actually, now that this crisis has, I wouldn't say calmed down, but things have calmed down in the Zatari schools, they can actually provide education. So even focusing on where we can, where there are gaps would be great, just to provide more awareness on that.
Yeah, that's a great point. In fact, I'm going to transition to questions now, but speaking of gaps, another of our fellows alongside Faranisa did some reporting in Zatari and was looking at the issue of maternal health and found that the funding cuts have led to a massive lack of resources in the only maternal health clinic, at least at that time, in the entire camp. So I think we might also hold in our minds the ways in which some of the maternal health issues are connected to the early childhood development issues. So I'd love to hear all of your questions, and we can turn it over to you now.
Hi. When I'm looking at those numbers, one get the feeling that a refugee child is automatically a trauma-inflicted or a traumatized child. While in fact, sometimes because they were born in such conditions, so for them this is the default. So it's not something, for them it's not, my camp is my home to a certain extent, some of them. So how would you attend to the idea of not over-accommodating and looking at the child as poor you should be traumatized, so let me take care of you to a certain extent?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think that we know for any child, we know the basics of what all children need. And so we start with that. We start with kind of the basics of early childhood development, and then thinking about how we would identify those children that have an accumulation of adversity that goes beyond maybe just the baseline for that area. But I think the starting position for most of, if you visit like our preschools or our parenting programs, I would send my son to the preschool. I would love to get a home visit from the home visitor, and so it's not that they're only intended for populations that are just the poor you, but it's an extra support for places where people are experiencing stress. What I think we need to also understand is then what are the additional services that may be required when we encounter situations where it is above the norm in terms of the child's level of adaptation to that context.
Did you want to add anything? Thank you. That's a really important question. I think it can be really easy for us to pathologize. Faranisa, and then
we talk about safety a lot in terms of the effectiveness of ECD, and everything that we've been talking about now is safety more in these fragile states. But my question is kind of going forward, what are the multi-sector initiatives or interventions that address racism that children in Western countries or Europe or the US will experience going to school, walking around on the street. I think that we obviously need to address safety in fragile states, but I'm wondering what is being done for the safety, which is usually psychological, but sometimes also physical, of racism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you want to take that one?
Yeah. So I don't think it's a problem that's specific to the West. Refugees were seen, unfortunately, as a burden in more than just the West. So I think some of the things that can be done are in terms of policy. So for example, in Jordan, some of the Syrian students were integrated into schools, and not only in second shifts by changing some of the policies. They didn't require any of their papers to be available, because when parents are fleeing, they're not thinking of taking any of their transcripts or anything. So some of the policies made were removing the need for papers for Syrian refugees, and that kind of creates some more social cohesion where students are in schools with the host community. And actually, some interesting findings we've done through our work and research is some of the teachers don't know which are the Syrian refugees. They're not sure if they have Syrian refugees in their classroom because they've become so well integrated in the class. So some of the things could be better integration into the education system, removing some of the policies around paperwork, just to ease the transition from their communities into the host community. So those are some of the things that can be done to just humanize the refugee crisis in a sense.
We had a question all the way in the back.
Good morning, everybody. My question is, considering that Syria was falling behind in the ECD goals before the conflict, we're talking about 26 children of the children were stunted. There is no equal opportunity of health development. 50% of them only experience childhood development activity, and 87 of them experience violence. Now, and this is rarely is highlighted in the media coverage. According to your experience in this field, how could you prioritize your goals with those postponed goals that should have been met before? And how does this lay extra burden on the NGOs and on the plans that could be focused or targeted towards the refugees, especially children? Should I repeat the question?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Syria was falling behind in the ECD goals, before the conflict, according to the World Bank statistics or the Pan-Arab Survey Health, based on Pan-Arab Survey Health, with different numbers exposing the children for violence, lack of experience for development, childhood development activity, and even the growth. So now you are dealing with a complicated issue. You have postponed goals that should have been met before. Mm-hmm. It's not all about the crisis, and this is rarely highlighted in the media coverage. There are issues before, and now the situation is complicated, and this lay more burden for the NGOs. How could they prioritize their goals so they can? Do you manage all the bundle, or do you just pick which to start with?
So considering how much ECD is a cross-cutting issue across health, nutrition, education, I guess it goes back to the NGO and their own kind of vision and mission. So some might focus solely on health. Queen Rania Foundation focuses on education and development, so we would tackle the educational aspects along with some psychosocial support. So I'm guessing each NGO would kind of focus on the area that they have specialized in.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add, it's in other contexts of the world, it's not unusual where we have this the compounding crisis, right? Where it's a country that also isn't meeting its goals across many different areas, and then you have a crisis that occurs. And so I think the approach, or, potentially one source of optimism is that when you have a humanitarian intervention and you have NGOs and other partners coming together, it can help to try to understand how you're not able to fix the problems from before, but at least sort of start afresh in a way. So for many of the Syrian families who we now are working with, both within Syria and other places, they're receiving services that they never had before. And so, if we can find a way to work with whatever longer term solution is in place for these contexts to make sure that they're sustainable and scalable, for me, I have a lot of hope that that can, improve the country as a whole, and address some of both the prior gaps and help the country recover.
And would it be helpful if folks said their names and institutions beforehand? That way, I know we're all a little jet-lagged and still getting to know each other, and it might be a nice way to, if you can say your name and your affiliation before you speak. I think we had a question there, and then we'll go down this row. Looks like we've got a row of questions.
My name is Sima Diab. I'm a Syrian freelance photojournalist, and so I have a couple of questions because I've been writing furiously. So one of my questions is most of people, we're talking so far in the example in the context of Jordan, but I've been covering the region and Southern Europe and migration crisis there. And most of the people that I have seen have been displaced more than twice. So they're going into third displacement, sometimes even fourth displacement, if you include the migration. And one of the things that I saw photographed extensively was the trauma of third displacement, where there's a compounded trauma from their first. So their first might be the bombings, internal displacement. Second is a country like Jordan, for instance, or Turkey, and then movement across Europe. And in Croatia, for instance, I saw families being separated and children being separated from their parents. And so I guess there's a couple of questions here. Do these programs that are early childhood education programs addressing compounded trauma over the experience? Is it a cross-section of like, here's an education program and we're going to address your trauma as well? Or are they dealt with separately? Is it an integrated approach? I mean, what in the early childhood programs that we're talking about addresses the trauma of the children from across their spectrum? And second, I guess it's more like a question from a childhood development point of view to journalists. If you were to witness that kind of trauma happening to children from governments, organizations, institutions, do you have a moral obligation to stop it? The separation of families and children and things like that.
If you were to witness it, sorry, as a...
From a healthcare point of view, not from a journalistic, ethical point of view. And I had another question about the app, just because I've been writing. So, were those apps for refugees? Or are they only for Jordanian families, like the Karim and Jen app?
They're made for everyone. We haven't specified a group, Jordanian versus Syrian refugee. It's available for everyone to download and use. We know disadvantaged communities, whether they're Jordanian, whether they're Syrian refugees, have trouble accessing learning resources and materials. So we haven't specified a target. They are for anyone who needs them.
I was just wondering, because the penetration for that within camps, for instance, I mean, is that part of the process of the thinking for the apps, or is it just like we created an app and here you can use it?
In our work, we try to target everybody. We don't really single out a community or specific people, so we don't really think of specific groups. We try to get it out there for the public, for the general use. We try to target any disadvantaged people, and that's how we think when we're developing the app.
We can circle back to the first two questions, and then when we move forward,
the first
since we've got
question,
about
yes.
20 minutes left, we'll go one question per person.
They didn't answer
Did you
my
want to circle
question
back
yet.
to the first?
They didn't answer my question yet.
You had a question about both health providers, whether they should be intervening.
Right, health providers and also compounded ongoing trauma within the refugee situation. So are these early childhood programs basically addressing the trauma throughout the programs, or is it a side thought? Is it an afterthought? Is it something that we do through psychosocial work on the side, or is it within the educational system?
Yeah. Yeah. Great question. So the first question, I think we do this, we address trauma at various different levels, although I don't think we always do it as well as we should, which is one of the reasons why we're having another meeting on Thursday and bringing together some of the regional experts and some of the people here to help advise us on how we can go deeper when there are children or family members who are observed to have real severe issues that we're not really being able to tackle right now. One interesting group that's going to join us on Thursday is called the Refugee Trauma Initiative, and they're based in Greece, and they have early childhood programs that have a deep focus on clinical counseling and psychology, and they bring together, they have psychologists within their staff, but then they also have, they're setting up sort of supervision structures and support structures that they could provide that kind of clinical guidance to practitioners across different areas when they're really encountering a situation that's difficult. We find one of the real challenges is how do you get a facilitator or a teacher who may not have a ton of experience working in the field, let alone working with trauma. They're not trained psychologists. So how do you get them really equipped to be excellent service providers, able to tackle a whole range of complicated issues in a very short period of time because we want them to start working. How do you do that effectively? So that's something that we're continually struggling with and trying to understand how to do better.
I think just to follow up on that is, from a point of view of a journalist, if you know families are being separated and there is a systemic kind of situation that is happening on the ground when you're there, do you have,
so that,
from a healthcare point of view? So that's his follow-up.
That we have clear sort of humanitarian, like that it is not okay in terms of separation of family, and we have strong sort of child protection systems and protection systems. I mean, I think, I don't know what your situation was, but I mean, if I as an individual was, in the middle of a government military separation operation, I would have to decide what would be the best approach in that instance. But in terms of informing, our authorities, the humanitarian system and the UN agencies, they should be able to intervene to ensure that that's not happening, because it's, yeah. I mean, a whole area of our work, though, is really dedicated to ensuring that there's no separation of children, and also family tracing and reunification when that does happen. Often we get there too late when those separations have already occurred, and so there's a huge stream of work around family tracing and reunification.
Thank you. I want to make sure we've got a little more than 10 minutes left, so I want to move down this row and maybe one question per person, just to make sure we get through everyone's. Thank you. I think, yeah, go for it.
Actually, I have been studying in Denmark. I studied photojournalism in journalism school, and there are a few journalists, young age, they went to a refugees camp in Lebanon or in Jordan, and they come with their own stories, and they publish in a magazine on the school. And there are a few things, some of them they wrote about it when they saw kids play. For example, if they saw a girl wearing as a groom, and they wrote, oh, that the girl's wearing as a groom because of child marriage on the camps. If they saw a few guys play with gun, they say also the same. It's like, yeah, it's a violent affect them, and that's why they had walking with gun and on the camps. Also, they had also comments that oh yeah, they wearing trousers of the army. They had in our army clothes. The kids buying it, and the family buying into the kids to be in the army and fight when they get older. Yeah, there are like really shallows. Like they went to the camps and they saw this and they writing articles and being published, and I think that's happened because they don't really have a knowledge of the Middle East, or maybe they don't have a chance to have the what we had now. And so I was thinking if there are any chance to you having any like lectures or seminar or anything in this journalist schools all over, especially in Europe, because they don't really know. Even in Denmark, they have just they discussing separating kids from the families for 6 hours every day, and they want to separating them in an island, and really crazy things.
Yeah.
In a country with very well developed, and they have like so much to do.
Well, it sounds like it would be a great role for you to take on since you're there.
I was doing my best, but actually I didn't. I was doing my best, and they avoiding talking to me, but it's I don't have numbers like as you had, and actually I didn't know like much as I know now. So yeah.
Yeah, well, let's talk more.
Yeah. And I can put in. Oh yeah.
I should just say that one of the purposes of this program, beyond helping each of you individually as reporters, is to create resources that will be on the web and to create the foundation for we hope this program will be the beginning of a conversation among journalists and journalism educators and others, and we will be creating resources that journalism schools can use. And maybe, one of the things we'll talk about toward the end of the program are ideas that all of you have for taking this project forward, for moving, expanding the influence of programs like this within journalism. So it's a really good question, and I think it goes to the heart of why we're here.
Yeah, I can't underscore that enough. I actually think it's one of the ways in which DART is such a tremendous resource for us in the room, and even a graceful way to critique or invite conversation with a fellow journalist. I'll often say, not in a critical fashion, but just in a engaging with colleagues fashion, I'll often say, have you seen the resources of the DART Center, and point people to particular links, and there's a lot of different kind of interventions that you have on the website that are available if you see this kind of work and you feel like it's easy to start that conversation. It's a nice thing about the work you do.
I guess I would just say to all of you, if any of these conversations today and tomorrow trigger ideas for how to change journalism or how to change journalism education, we can make that part of the conversation, especially on Wednesday when we talk about going forward. Anyway, we have a few more minutes for questions. So.
And we had 2 questions in this row. Yeah, okay, 3.
First of all, okay, I'm Fatin. I'm a video journalist from Lebanon. So one of the things that you came across is the integration of students in one schools. So I just have one question. How can we generalize the whole refugee crisis? Sometimes, as a journalist, I feel that it's not the specialization of each country, host country, is not taken very much into consideration. For example, in Lebanon, the curriculums of Lebanese is much more different from the Syrians, because in Lebanon we are mostly taught in English. Most of the language, even the mathematics and science and everything's in English. And then if we want to make integration of Syrians, they are facing a lot of problems, even if they are early age, because their parents are also not very aware of the language. So this is just, I'm not aware of what's the situation in Jordan, but this is one of the big problems that we as journalists face when we go and talk to the people, and they always tell us that maybe the humanitarian NGOs that they are working with are not very much aware of it. So it might be a kind of gap. I'm not sure about it, but my main question is not that. My question is, working mostly with researchers, information, number, and us on the field, we sometimes feel,
I sometimes feel that there is this gap. So if you would take a look into the media products on the content that we as journalists are giving, what kind of topics you think is missing? What kind of reports you think that we should highlight more? Is there certain sides or angles you think that we should pay attention more than others in a way, or something is really crucial and still missing?
Yeah, well, so in your first point, we do have education programs in Lebanon, but the government is quite strict about NGO involvement, and so we do only remedial for primary school, but we do have preschools because the government has allowed for community-based organizations to do preschool, so with the same Lebanese curriculum, so ensuring that we adhere to those standards. But the other question I think is a really great one, and I'm not sure I know all of the thoughts and ideas off the top of my head, but I think we're constantly trying to help state the case for why ECD is important, why it's effective, why it's cost effective, and how there's opportunities for it to grow. And so I think finding little kernels of hope through looking at a program that's really interesting, doing some of that, maybe a little bit of the boring economic analysis part, but even just the costing I think is really helpful, because then that's sort of, I mean, it's selfish, because then you're helping us make the case when we go to governments and others to say this is effective. But I think that, journalism is a really powerful way of getting into the ear of these decision makers and really changing the minds of the general population about the importance of this issue. And so I think anything that you can do towards that end would be greatly appreciated from my perspective.
Yeah, and I'll share a really quick resource on that front, because I think you're absolutely right that so often as journalists, I think we train ourselves to think that the substantive pieces are the investigative pieces and the takedown critiques. But there's a group called the Solutions Journalism Network, and they make really fantastic materials on thinking about how do you make substantive journalistic projects that hold people accountable by illustrating what's working, who's actually doing it right. So I would just recommend their materials as well, the Solutions Journalism Network, which is, I believe, based in New York, but has global satellites. Yes, I think we've got 2 questions here, and then if we've got time, we'll bundle a few others right there, and Linda, you also have one. Great.
I was hoping you guys could connect the dots a little bit on the childhood reading versus screens and apps. You obviously looked at it in the Jordanian situation. I was really surprised at how low the numbers were for reading versus 90% of the pre-K, so to speak, having screens. But at the same time, there's been a lot of talk of apps for kids and apps for refugees. So what's the data? What's the science? In the US, it's no screens under 2, and then limited under 5. Is it a cultural issue in terms of children's literature and getting books out there? Could you talk a little bit more about that and how that's being addressed?
So we tend to follow the same rules, so no screen time under the age of 2. So for our apps, we've limited the amount of time that they can spend in one sitting. So we've limited it to 30 minutes per sitting so that they don't spend more time than they should be spending on the app. With regard to the pre-K and the widespread availability of televisions, unfortunately, due to low resources, televisions are easy to have. You buy it once, it's up there, you don't need to maintain it. While books, they get worn and torn, so they're harder to replace. So another part of the research that we've done with Jordanian families is that very few of them have books at home, so 65% didn't have any books with their children. So there's many issues around that. It's whether cost-effective books are available for books that are not costly, they're not available for children. Content that is written and appeals to that age group is not very sufficient. So there are many aspects to this problem. We also very heavily believe that children shouldn't be spending that much time in front of television. So if we try to find like the smart ways of stopping the activities on the phones after some period is spent. So we try to combat that in some ways. But because we know that it's hard to get the resources out there nationwide, this is one of the quickest solutions so we don't miss the current generation, so to speak.
We only have a few minutes left, so what I suggest is maybe we take 3 questions, really concise, and then we'll try to wrap it up together if that works. So you had a question, Linda, and also Jane.
I will be really quick. My name is Elizotou, and I'm a journalist based in Athens, Greece. And I was wondering if we actually in Greece we have created some preschools and some kindergartens inside some camps, and this was really just because, okay, it doesn't help to the integration, but I was wondering if it helps in terms of development, although I can understand that it's bad not being in the same school with the Greek children. However, developmental, is it a step forward or not? How would you?
Okay, great. Does it work to take 3
Yeah,
timing-wise, or
take all 3 questions and then answer as best you can.
perfect? So Linda, you also had a question.
I would speak in Arabic if we have the time.
Sure. Perfect. Yeah, that's great.
Okay. Yeah. اسمي ليندا بلال، صحفية، سوريا، تركيا، هولندا. سؤالي هو، أو بالبداية أنا بشوف إنه موضوع الأطفال هن مش ما لازم نشوفها بطريقة عاطفية أو درامية، لأن هدول الأطفال اللي عاشوا تحت هذا الضغط، تحت هاي التروماز، هن بالمستقبل متوقع جدا أو نسبة كبيرة رح يتحولوا للتطرف، وبالتالي نحن عندنا جيل تاني من التطرف مواجهنا سواء الآن أو بعد كم سنة. ما فينا نحكي عن مشاريع حقيقية للتنمية أو لدعم الأطفال اللاجئين إذا ما قدرنا نحكي عن استقرار. الاستقرار الجغرافي اللي هو بيتزامن مع استقرار عاطفي، والاثنين هدول مرتبطين كتير بقرار سياسي. يعني مشاريع طويلة الأمد هي يفترض تكون بمناطق جغرافية محددة. لليوم ما في قرار سياسي واضح عن اللاجئين، هل هن رح يضلوا مكان ما هن وبالتالي يندمجوا حقيقة يندمجوا بالمجتمعات الجديدة اللي ما عادت جديدة، أو هن رح يرجعوا لسوريا. طبعا ما فينا نفصل كمان الأطفال اللاجئين عن أهليهم، مثل ما غالبيتنا بيعرف عودة الأهالي هي مرتبطة بكتير تعقيدات عن وضع كل عائلة ووضع الأمني، وإذا فيها ترجع أو لا، إذا مكان الرجوع آمن ولا لا. إذن هاي الحلقة هاي اللي عم ندور فيها اللي هي كلها بالنهاية بتصب بموضوع حديثنا. هل في تشبيك لحتى هو تحدي كتير كبير لحتى ناخد خليني أقول موافقة أو ناخد ضوء أخضر إنه عم نحكي عن ناس رح يرجعوا لبلادهم أو رح يضلوا مطرح ما هنن، سو نحن فينا بنعمل مشاريع طويلة الأمد معهم. شكرا.
Is that better? I just would love to know, because we don't have time now, how to get more context on the numbers you gave about the parents, especially a lot of the 40% numbers, and whether that had to do with there had been prior exposure to some of your programs or other parenting programs or ECD information, or that was a baseline that you were getting and upon that you acted upon. I just wasn't sure what stage in your work that represented. Thank you.
Why don't we start with that, because it's really direct, and then we'll go backwards.
Okay. So the numbers I was getting from, we conducted an early childhood development survey back in 2015, and we wanted it as a kind of baseline to inform our thinking around any programs that we will conduct. So we limited the mother's sample to Jordanian parents only because data around Syrian refugees was not sufficient for us to get a sample. But we don't expect much differences. So the numbers are from 1,800 mothers, and this information is all available on our website. So to your question, it was to inform our thinking around parental practices and what the scene is in the home learning environment.
And then we can move back both to the question about Greece and segregated preschools in the camps, and also Linda's question about the relationship between the kind of vicious cycle of geographic stability, emotional stability, politics.
Okay. The question about the camps in Greece, they were segregated just as refugees and Greek children, right? No. Or no? Sorry.
No. Actually, in specific areas where are no preschools, the government has decided that they should open some sort of preschooling or non-formal education for little children inside the camps, in order for them to have something to do and not to be isolated, but they are integrated in the schooling. You can go as a Syrian refugee and write your child to the normal Greek school.
Okay.
So, no, they have the access, but I'm asking for those that are living, for instance, for 5 or 6 months in Moria, and then they are going to move to the mainland of Greece, so they have decided that they shouldn't leave them without any kind of schooling, and they have done some inside the camps, and the and activists and the educational community have criticized that you don't help them in that way. And I wanted to ask, in terms of development, is there some help in terms of development? I know what happens with integration, but in terms of having something to, having books, having toys to play, you know.
Is this a good idea?
Is this a good idea developmentally?
Yeah.
Because many of them are going to leave those camps.
Right.
That's
right.
So,
yeah. I mean, so the research on early childhood development is very strong in that it has a positive effect, and particularly for children who are in situations of adversity. And one of the really important things is that it's a safe space. It should be a safe space, and it establishes predictable routines with a nurturing caregiver, and that restoring that sense of normalcy, providing children with the ability to play and engage with peers in a safe space is so critical, particularly when their lives have been so chaotic. So I think in general it's a good idea. The only caveat is that there's a range of quality, and that you do see some places where it's a structure, there's no training for the staff, it's unclear, if what's really going on inside those, and maybe the children were upset to leave their caregivers coming in. And so sometimes I actually visit these places and have mixed feelings, because it's clear that they need more training and resources before they're getting to a place where they're really providing what these centers intend to. The only other part of that I think they need to be careful about is really preparing the children for transition. If they're only spending 3 months there or 4 months there, I think that can be done well in a developmentally appropriate way, but you don't want to cause another disruption. If they've gotten used to the stable environment that they go to every day, and then they have to move on to the next place after 4 months, there just needs to be a lot of thoughtful kind of programming around how to prepare for that transition.
And then we can close out regarding Linda's question on the relationship between the geographical stability, emotional stability, and the fact that, if I'm summarizing decently, that this is all kind of undergirded by this political reality that informs the early childhood development issues. It's big. Yeah, we can continue that one over coffee a bit, but if you want to chime in, first thought.
So if I understand your question correctly, you were wondering, like, So for NGOs who want to have long-term, إنه بدهم مشاريع طويلة الأمد. Sorry, I'll speak in English.
Yeah. Most of the NGOs now, they said that we cannot start a huge project because we not sure that those families or children will stay here in Greece or in Jordan or Lebanon. So we want to be sure that our project will be, we can continue.
I mean, in a way, it's a related question, right? Because it's asking, when you know people's situation is volatile and unstable, how much of an investment, how do you think about investment? I mean, I think maybe that's the question.
Okay, that's an interesting question. So I think things like Katie mentioned, remedial programs, these are things that you can do on the spot and just to make sure something is happening at the moment. Things like e-learning that don't need like a physical space, so you don't need to set up a place where if you're afraid that children will move away, that your resources have gone to waste. So investing in ideas that might not need a physical space could be a potential. But in terms of like the political instability or whether they'll be moving, that is definitely something that it's a risky thing to consider when you're starting a new project or pilot. So perhaps things that through e-learning or remedial programs that are short in length that can catch students up or that offer also psychosocial support can be considered in such humanitarian contexts.
Thank you. Thanks to both of the panelists and for your great questions.
Okay, and thank you, Sarah, for shepherding us through this complicated conversation, which can continue during the coffee break and the cigarette break. Let's reconvene at 15 minutes past the hour here, when we will begin a deep dive with our friend Stacey Drury into the science, the neuroscience of adverse childhood experiences and the neuroscience of resilience, and begin to think about how that applies in this situation. So thank you, guys.